A few weeks ago, we went on a journey with one of the best cameras I should have never sold, the Leica Monochrom Type 246. And in that video, I happened to mention in passing that Leica hadn't exactly gotten back to me about reviewing either the Q2 Monochrom or the M10 Monochrom. A couple of days after I dropped that video, however, I got a call from a friend who mentioned he had just picked up a new camera and he asked if I wanted to try it out. What's going on YouTube? I hope you guys are having a spectacular day. My name is Quintavius Oliver, and if you haven't already, go ahead and smash that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, because it's those two little things right there that allow me to continue creating content for you guys. Now, before we get started with this video, I definitely want to make sure I give a shout out to my friend Eric for allowing me to hang on to his Leica Q2 Monochrom for the past couple of days. I've had a blast with this camera. It is an absolute amazing tool. But before we start talking about this camera right here, let's talk about how we even got here. You see, back in 2012, Leica released their original Leica Monochrom based on the Leica M9, and that camera was okay, but it doesn't hold a candle to what Leica would later release in the Leica Typ 246. And I made a video about that a couple of weeks ago. I'll leave a link in the description below for that video. Check that out. Let me know in the comments what you think of that in comparison to this. But after the 246, Leica released the Leica M10 Monochrom, and this came shortly after. So that means the Leica Q2 Monochrom is the first and only Leica monochrome camera that is not based on the Leica M system. And for me, that was a little bit weird initially. You see, to me, a Leica monochrome camera is all about simplicity. The idea that the camera gets out of your way, just like any other Leica M body does. However, it pushes the limits of your creativity because it only allows you to see light and tonality. No distractions with color or no video or anything like that. And I really did enjoy my time with every Leica monochrome camera I've tried up until now. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy this camera, but it did take a little bit of time for me to get used to it, because this camera does a few things that I don't think that it really should. You see, this camera is unique in that it's based on the Leica Q2, and I've talked in the past about how much I enjoyed my time with the original Leica Q. So getting this in my hand was pretty familiar. However, what you get with this camera is an amazing black and white only 47 megapixel full frame sensor topped with a 28mm f1.7 Similux. And that pair right there are absolutely spectacular. That is a killer combo for a fraction of the price of what you would pay for an M10 monochrome and a 28mm Similux. That's an astronomical sum of money. So this right here is an absolute bargain. For me, the lens and the sensor are usually where I stop, and that's usually all I care about. But when I initially picked this camera up, there were a few features that stood out right off the bat that really gave me a hard time when I started shooting. When I initially took this camera out to go photograph, for the first 10 or 15 minutes, almost all of my photographs were out of focus. I later learned that I had the touchscreen activated, and that's the way it comes out of the box. I instantly turned that off, but I really don't understand why this camera has a touchscreen. Again, for me, a Leica monochrome camera is about simplicity. So there are a couple of tech features in this camera that I don't quite understand, and I don't really think that this camera needs them, the touchscreen being one of them. Another feature that I think this camera really doesn't need, and one that I found that kind of got in my way, was the video feature. Because this thing has a touchscreen, I found myself switching by accident from photo mode to video mode quite often, and that kind of got annoying, especially when you consider a camera like this isn't really suited for video shooters in the first place. This camera does make amazing video in 4K with this black and white sensor. However, you're left with just the microphone on the top. You don't have any ports to plug in any external microphones or use any external monitors. And that's kind of annoying, because why would you shoot video with this thing in the first place? To me, this is a photographer's tool, and it's very capable of being a tool in the most pure form, in that you can't switch lenses and you're left to only work with what this camera allows you to do. And that brings me to my third gripe about this camera. It has a crop mode. Now this one's kind of subjective because I see why it's there. While you're limited to shooting with only this 28mm Similux lens, you do have the option of cropping internally while you're making your pictures. That is to say, you can make this camera a 35, a 50, or a 75 with that giant 47 megapixel sensor that allows you to crop in camera. The reason I think this is kind of a useless feature though, is when you're shooting in DNG or RAW mode and you import the pictures into your computer, the pictures are going to be 28mm focal length anyway. Now you can crop in post. The pictures are huge. These files are extremely detailed and extremely malleable. So I get why people crop. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with cropping. I just don't understand why this camera allows you to do it if it only affects the JPEGs, and if you're shooting in RAW, that's neither here nor there anyway. I think having a 28mm fixed lens camera should just be about having a 28mm fixed lens camera. And I think one should just learn to get closer. Otherwise, why bother with a camera like this? But that's just my opinion. I think it's an amazing camera. I just think that some of these tech features take away from the amazing experience you get when you strip all that away and you appreciate what this camera really is intended for. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys that the pictures that come out of this Leica camera are absolutely amazing. There's no question about that. But there's something that I think everyone who's looking into these cameras should know. When you pick up one of these cameras and look through the EVF, a lot of times you'll see something that's not entirely true. That is to say, if you tweak your settings in the camera to bump up your contrast or the detail or anything like that, you're gonna see exactly what your JPEGs would have looked like. But if you're shooting in DNG, the files that you get on your computer are not going to look like what you see in camera. Remember that, because it's a lot like shooting a log profile in video. The pictures are going to appear flat, and that's not to say that this camera isn't capable. I think what a lot of people miss about the flat files that come out of this camera is that they are extremely malleable. You can pull out intense levels of detail, bring back stuff from the shadows, and even if you don't clip the highlights too much, because this camera does have a habit, and most monochrome cameras, all monochrome cameras, have a habit of clipping those highlights at an extreme level. But if you get it just right, you can even pull detail back from that as well. The files that come out of this are extremely robust. Just keep in mind when you see those flat files come up on your computer, I really think the files in this camera are geared towards the person who is going to work these files. You really can massage a lot of detail out of these files. And I use the word massage because beating these files to death, like a lot of people do with other cameras, is not what this is for. However, if you're someone who doesn't like to open up Photoshop or edit your pictures, you can shoot in JPEG, or you can do what I like to do and shoot with these color filters. Using these color filters can alter your pictures dramatically. I've discussed using color filters in the past, but I'll give you a quick rundown right now. Whatever color filter you put on your camera, that's the color that's going to get filtered out of your picture. So if you use a red filter on your lens and try to photograph something with red text, you won't be able to see that red text at all. However, if you're trying to photograph a blue sky with that red filter, that sky will turn out almost black, a very deep gray, if you will, and you'll be able to get a pop in contrast between the blue sky and the white clouds. If you use a green filter on someone's face and they have red hair and freckles, that red hair and those freckles are going to pop because that red is going to contrast against the green filter that you're using. One of the last features I want to talk about with this camera that I didn't quite understand, still don't understand, but can appreciate, is the idea that it has a macro mode. Now, I used the original Leica Q for quite some time, a couple of years, and loved that camera. Took it with me almost everywhere, but I still can't figure out why it has a macro mode. The fact that it's capable of doing so is amazing, and I love that it has the feature, but I can't really figure out why it does. That being said, when you've got 47.3 megapixels and a lens as sharp as this, it's hard not to play around with the feature. I had fun with it, but it's not something that I would use every day or really at all. If any of you guys happen to have any of the Leica Q cameras and use the macro feature regularly, go ahead and drop your link in the comments below, because I would absolutely love to see what someone is doing with the macro mode on this camera. I'm sure it's capable of spectacular results. I just can't really figure out why I would use it. Now, the last feature I want to talk about on this camera is its ability to crank the ISO way up. I think the top ISO on here is 100,000. Why you need to go that high, I don't know, but it does kind of have a nice signature. It looks kind of like if you push Tri-X to 1600 or even 3200, it's not absurd amounts of grain, and I do like that. I've bumped it up all the way up to, I want to say, 25,000 by accident, and I really almost didn't notice the noise at all. I kind of had to tweak the file to notice any type of noise at all in that picture. And even then, that noise really mimics film grain. Because there's no RGB sensor in this camera, you don't really get that digital noise, and I really appreciate that. Now, if you crank the ISO up way high, up to 100,000 if you will, this thing will give you a little bit of banding if you try to manipulate those files in any way. That's not to say that the files aren't usable. Pixel it didn't happen, so I'd rather make a picture that's kind of noisy, kind of grainy, might have some banding, just to say that I made the picture in the first place. Otherwise, I really don't see a reason to have an ISO that goes up that high, especially when you've got in-body stabilization and you can shoot at lower shutter speeds, like a 20th of a second or even a 15th of a second if you don't drink coffee like I do. You could probably even get it down to half a second if you're very, very still. The in-body stabilization in this is great, and that allows you to not have to crank the ISO way high. Oh, I almost forgot one last thing that you should know about this camera. The files are huge. 47 megapixel full frame sensor, you're gonna get enormous files. So if you're using a memory card like this 32 gigabyte SanDisk, you're gonna choke up the buffer on this and you're gonna have to wait between certain shots. I went out yesterday, tried to make some pictures in the middle of the city, put the wrong card in. Normally I'm using a pretty fast 128 gigabyte card, but I had this 32 gigabyte card with me, and it's a slow card. If you're using a slow card with minimal capacity, you're gonna choke up the buffer on it and you're gonna run out of file space very quickly. I think this thing will hold maybe 250 files. If you shoot a lot, which I know a lot of people do these days with digital cameras, a 32 gigabyte card is not going to do it for you. With all of that being said, once you get rid of all the unnecessary tech features that this camera has and really just get down to the idea that you can make pictures with it, this camera really is a true photographer's tool. The ability to manual focus or use the snappy autofocus is great. The sensor is spectacular. The lens is phenomenal, and the in-body stabilization is great, especially if you don't want to crank your ISO up way too high in low light. This camera, in its simplest, most pure form, is everything that I could ever want in a camera. And that's why I picked this guy up. Now, this is my new Fujifilm Class W. I picked this camera up a couple of days ago, or rather it was shipped to me from Japan a couple of days ago. It's got a fixed 28mm f2.8 lens, and I think that this is exactly what I need in a camera. I think the best way that I could sum up the Leica Q2 Monochrom is over-engineered simplicity. It's kind of like if a Tesla made a car that made artificial engine noises. We know it's a Tesla. We know it's 2021. We know that there's technology all around us. And I don't necessarily want a camera to pretend like it's something retro and something new at the same time. And I think that's why the Leica Q2 Monochrom exists. It's, for all intents and purposes, almost identical in function to the Leica M10 Monochrom. However, this gives you everything that one would need for the future. And the Leica M10 is for somebody like me who appreciates the good old days. If you don't mind all the tech that comes in this over-engineered yet oversimplified tool, definitely pick one of these guys up. I think it's an amazing tool, but for me, I think I'm gonna stick with the old school things. And look out for a video for this guy pretty soon, because I'm shooting them side by side and I'm having a blast with it. Till next time, hope you guys stay safe, stay sane, peace.